Journalism is not only to inform, but to enlighten, to rise above fear and to probe, to give voice to the voiceless and to hold those in power accountable. Journalism is to be accessible to all.
Καλησπέρα σας. Εδώ είμαστε, συνεχίζουμε. Όσοι είσαστε μαζί μας από τις 10 το πρωί, σε αυτή την 24ωρη ροή συζήτησης απόψεων, διαφωνιών, πάρα πολλών ερωτήσεων και πάρα πολλών θεμάτων γύρω από τη δημοσιογραφία.
For those of you who have been with us since this morning, so this is the February cycle of dialogues. You might recall that there had been such a round last year when we were debating journalism in a crisis-struck domain of media. Things have reversed somewhat. It's the day after. We've talked about it for hours on end since this morning. And there is increased mobility, new tools, new models, new methods. So we find ourselves here problematizing what comes next, what we might do, joining forces to render the landscape more distinct and clear, and how we can make our way forward. Stavros Niarchos will take the matter up. It's something we've discussed a lot together. It's not a question of knowledge having reached us, it's that the ground is rather arid. We have a very interesting roster of speakers, and we'll take up imagery as a means to pursue storytelling and what modern-day journalists can do for investigative reporting, to obtain resources, to find channels, to set up a model, a media model. So I have Stavros Niarchos to my side. We take turns. I don't need to make any introductions for Stavros. Thank you for being with us, Stavros. It's good that we have an investigative reporter here in Greece. There's a lot you could tell us about reporting and about the media cycle and news updates and what one can do to find resources to pursue one's job. We have Maria Ristik from the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network with us. We can tutoyer one another, as the French say. It'd be very interesting to see generally what's going on in the Balkans, which are faced with one more problem related to safety, but how to preserve their life in pursuing the profession. What do you do for that? We have also the president of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, Andreas Rakopoulos. There's plenty of questions to address, and on our panel on investigative reporting, we took up the question of why foundations internationally are trying to support journalists in what they do. There's plenty of journalists who turn to the foundations for support. Iliana Magra has joined us from London. Welcome. She's a journalist with the New York Times. Thank you for being with us. You bring a breath of fresh air with you from different climes. We've heard many ideas and views and positions. How did you manage, as the crisis was peaking, to make a getaway? And now you are experiencing the crisis within the family of European nations. What does that mean for the press? What does that mean for people generally? When Trump was elected, the media ran scared because of the fake news outbreak. So you've got a lot to tell us about that. And Bertrand Pequeri is with us as well from the Global Editors Network. Thank you very much for being with us, Bertrand. We are all agog to hear what you have to say. Your forthcoming conference this summer is already hotly debated amongst journalists. It will be interesting to hear from you based on your experience. We are going to find what you say very valuable, no doubt. Anyway, this conference is an annual event. It brings together a big network. You meet journalists in many countries, lands, nations. You meet people from all levels, tiers of the profession. I've been a bit long-winded, but I trust you will forgive me, Tassos. It'd be helpful, Tassos, to give a helping hand to explain where journalists find themselves currently if they want to investigate a specific topic in a focused manner. Where will we encounter them? Good afternoon from me as well. I think that the problem 10 years down the road from the start of the crisis is not just a dearth of media, it's that we haven't seen enough of an attitude or mindset change. There seems to be a paucity of courage, bravery, and that's not something you can buy, lay your hands on and buy. Hear this, we had a whistleblower, Patrick Biggerman, and he had his book presentation. After Bickenfeld had had his say, I was approached by a gentleman from one of Thessaloniki's industries, and he said, I want you to know something. Our fluid waste finds its way to the Thermaic Gulf, not treated. Now, he came back a few weeks later, and I found that the industrial park he works for belongs to the Hellenic Bank for Industrial Investments. Now, before the liquid waste empties into the Gulf, it goes through the waste management unit. There's 3 persons who are in the know, and the regional secretariat grants permission so that this situation can continue. Now, the liquid waste management unit was set up for a fraction of the output. I spoke with a pensioner who is managing that installation, and he said, you can't make this revelation because you will take a lot of people down with you. And if you don't want to pick a fight with those people, you need to engage a different kind of dialogue that will certainly not find you friends with them at the end of the day. There's got to be a no bullshit discussion, to speak plainly. Now, 10 years down the road in the crisis, we journalists have not conquered the kind of equanimity and impartiality to manage the issues. You might need to sample the water. You'd have to pay for the assays. There's no one else to pay for the assays. If you live in Thessaloniki, if you don't live in Thessaloniki, you have to take a trip there time and time again and meet with many people there. So these are thorny issues, but they are part and parcel of reaching the resolution to make it your business to engage with the matter. Of course, this is an environment known for its polarization. The Third Greek Republic is changing, but we don't know to what. And it's becoming a more authoritarian environment. If you look at the Hungarian example, once we reach the level of Hungary, perhaps there won't be any point in doing this job or earning this money. That's something you need to take thought of. Another thing we need to go beyond is the question of attitude. Once we see what's what, and we know that we've got to break that news, then you have to do something that's not the practice in Greece. In Inside Story, we've had occasion to speak with businesses and say a few things that do pertain to them. There is a difficulty, admittedly, but there is also this salutary educational aspect to talking about these things. Now, having said that, I would like to hear what the other speakers would like to say, but before embarking on that, is it a question of the ends justifying the means? Because we have had many a discussion on the negative impact of how journalists have to cover their expenses for their investigation. Well, yes, of course it plays a role.
Nevertheless, and as I said before, I just shared with you what this retiree told me way back in time when we started with this. He told me, you cannot do that, we'll go into a fight, that's what you should be doing. My attitude is somehow reticent. No, I won't even be doing that. I wouldn't go even into the trouble of going down this path of having my expenses redeemed. There must be a way, though, for my expenses to be redeemed, and moreover, I need to convince those who are to pay for my expenses that there is a way to follow. I need to go all the way through to the end of this story, rather than overwhelming the reader with questions. I mean to also provide some answers, and indeed explain that it pays to look for the answers. Maria.
Speak from a perspective of a manager of the organization, although I was a journalist, and it's a bit of different perspective how to do investigative journalism. And when we speak, I can speak from the Balkan experience, obviously, and there you usually choose bad stories, and because the media freedom is declining and we don't have so many free media outlets. So for us, investigative journalism is basically an island for only few selected journalists and organizations who are doing this. And usually these journalists, especially in the last couple of years are always targeted as traitors, then different kind of spies for the different kind of governments, simply because the mainstream media are controlled by the different politicians, usually those in power. So the media who are independent are usually funded from foreign donations. Some of them are foundations, some of them are actually projects by different institutions, mostly in the Western Balkans. It's the European Union. And we at BIRN as well were almost weekly attacked in every country where we work by these labels. So it's always that we are either pro-Albanian or pro-Serbian or pro-Bosnian, but we're never, I would say for them, they would never consider us objective. And in this, I would say, very critical environment, how we operate is that we are basically functioning on two main principles. One is that we are trying to bring quality journalism, and we are giving voice to the credible journalists. So in this era where you have disinformation, and we were listening that to the previous panel, it's completely the same in the Western Balkans as well. It's very important who is the person who writes and who is the publisher. So I think now that's the key area for all the small investigative centers to actually maintain the credibility and for their journalists to remain credible journalists. How we do that? We usually support our journalists through, it's a very small group, but it's like continuous funding, and other journalists through different kind of grant schemes. And then the other way how we're trying to improve the impact of our work is to do different kind of collaborations. So this is the new, I would say, thing that we introduced in the last couple of 3 or 4 years, because it was very difficult to maintain impact in the atmosphere where you are basically only functioning online, so a limited audience can actually see your work. So then we opted for collaborations, and we do collaborations in 2 ways, and I think this is something where, for example, it would be interesting to see more deep cooperation between the Balkans and Greece. One thing is cross-border journalism, because we all know that our politicians and our mafia people are cooperating very well. So I don't see the reason why journalists wouldn't cooperate well as well. And there are so many topics that are interacting, and it's not just politics like Greece, Macedonia name. It's actually, for example, environment, it's organized crime. It's so many other topics where basically this region has in common. And then if you don't have, for example, story published in Serbia, you will have your stories will be published in Greece, Bosnia, Macedonia, elsewhere, and then the media in Serbia will take it anyway. And it's much bigger impact if a team of journalists from different countries is working on these stories. And this is, I would say, one of the core mandates of BIRN. So this is what we are trying to do in the Balkans, and we also considered Greece the Balkans. I don't know what people would say here.
Ναι, ρωτήσω κάτι, συγγνώμη.
Okay, I'm sorry to pop in, but I have a question. Following what you have been saying so far, and especially following the way whereby you explain you have been cooperating, and what you've been saying to us about all these cooperation schemes, besides this traditional model, it would be interesting for us to also know whether this new approach has been affecting the traditional means and medias in the Balkans. Have you seen any changes in that sense?
What we are getting with this kind of collaboration is basically more impact. So this was the only way that we found to reach more audience. Because if you have, as I said, cross-border themes, then you will have also more media outlets and more people will be engaged. One more way that we also introduce collaboration is that we collaborate also with the civil society organizations and tech companies to improve either our reach or the advocacy, because we as a media organization don't want to do the advocacy. Our only idea is that the story is heard. But for example, we partner with civil society organization working in different areas. So for us, we were working, for example, with the different environmental NGOs and in the area of dealing with the past in the Balkans. And I think this is something that also international investigative centers are doing as well. Like Bellingcat is cooperating with Human Rights Watch, then, for example, with The Planet, who is doing geolocation. So I think this is the model that is now basically spreading elsewhere. And I'm not sure how much we journalists in the Balkans have been exploring this area as well.
Thank you. Να δούμε τώρα από πού...
Fine then. Let us see then what is the main trigger of interest for the various foundations and how come professional journalists and reporters are attractive to foundations and vice versa. This is a very interesting topic indeed. It's not that we are attracted by journalists and reporters, nor are we really targeted by them. This is a difficult time for all, and what with this conjuncture, credibility has been suffering, trust has been suffering, the whole of the community is very mistrustful, and they place little trust in everything from church and the media down to politicians. We as a foundation have no intention, nor is there any policy with us to do something specific with respect to journalists. We're simply focusing upon those areas where we believe there's a chance for a better tomorrow and for communication to be improved. So, incidentally, we find that there is a problem in the world of media, not only in Greece but also abroad. There are some common features of crisis in the media, both in Greece and abroad, and if there is a solution to be found, it comes from the lower levels and going up. Yes, there is a want of courage and there is a want of hope. To provide hope and some push, you need also to have the assets and eventually inspire people with passion, with integrity, people who really are willing to explore what the basis has to offer and go up the ladder. And that is the idea behind the creation of this initiative. This morning, as I was following you, something came to me, something from the Star Trek, "Beam me up, Scotty." That was the motto that came to me. Yes, I'm trying to beam everyone up into a space of safety, and by saying safety, I mean there is a space that obeys no agendas, the only agenda being for things to be done right, and for people who are involved in this space to start believing in the mission. This is the only recipe for success. Back at the time when we were building this civic center down in along the coast, there was a major bet. We were wondering whether this will become popular with people and whether people will find this to be their own space. Well, we were successful. The first major bet was won. Another bet was for this to become a paradigm, a true example for people to replicate elsewhere in Greece, because there are so many other areas in this country that might go down the same path. Philosophically speaking, then, we're doing something similar with the media. We're trying to help the young. Whatever encouragement we may provide, we will. And most above all, we're trying to convey hope. Hope for people to embrace this new idea, to make it their own, create ownership, and yes, why not beam everybody up? Well, let me insist a bit further on this, and forgive me if I do not report this correctly. The view also has been expressed, however, that as there is a major trend for foundations to come up here and there with scholarships and subsidies and donations and grants, mostly towards the materialization of journalist research, nothing really happens, and I say there is not much coverage about what the foundations are doing and how they're acting. Very interesting. Let me share with you something that dates back to 1997. We started back in 1996, so we're 23 years old. Many projects have come up and been implemented ever since, and many grants have been awarded. There was a time of a grant somewhere in Greece, and there was a phone call from a reporter who told us, here you will be launching these new premises. How much will you be giving me to attend? The answer was nothing. And he said, well, if you don't give me something, then I will report nothing on you. I will spare you what I told him in response, but never mind, just to give you a sense of the mentality. There are foundations of all kinds. Our foundation is known for what we are. Our footprint is well known. And, you know, one idea about iMEdD is to, why not launch an investigative report on our foundation? Yes, it takes some transparency, otherwise one enters a self-destructive cycle. If one believes in doomsday and believes everything goes wrong, then there's no way out. It takes courage. Yes, there are many things to be improved, and there are so many wrong things in the world of media, but this doesn't mean it doesn't pay to improve. And perhaps what we're sharing with you is a bit of hope, and incidentally provide some kind of promise for a better tomorrow. It's not about doing business in Greece or abroad, nor are we after any speculation of sorts, and there is no purpose of sorts behind that. That's what I had to say. Iliana? Well, prior to positioning myself vis-a-vis what has been said, a question to Mr. Taylor, since indeed I've been wondering, you have been elaborating on the possibility of a story to be stopped before ever hitting the news. Well, how likely is it for a chief editor or a newspaper owner to give a line of approaches to the kind of research a reporter will be conducting? The answer, well, if you're after a career in journalism, you have to start by saying no, not saying yes. And yet another thing, most of the times a chief editor or a director does not know what the whole subject matter is. So 97% or so of the times we ourselves create the whole issue, depending on how formidable we believe the hurdles are in front of us. And the more overwhelmed one is by a story, the more obsessed, if I may use this term, one becomes by the story, the more likely is it for the story to go all the way to hit the news. It's a struggle and a long, long way. Yannis Papadopoulos, who is doing the marathon of sorts, indeed it's a marathon. And yes, one might just as well find oneself in areas where everything goes wrong and perhaps one has to let go. Or one may even go to the chief editor and say, I'm giving up, I can't do it. After 33 years in this job, only rarely have I been told what to do and when to do it. Most of the times I give up for a variety of reasons, for lack of means, or because I don't believe in myself enough, or because a door was closed, or because there was no cross-referencing, no corroboration of story.
Υπάρχει, Τάσο, και η περίπτωση αρκετών συναδέλφων.
Well, I have in mind the case of many professionals, colleagues of ours, who just cannot afford to do anything else. If the chief editor or the director sees something or comes across something, even in the social media, that truly undermines our credibility, and because this might be aired by almost everyone, perhaps the director will say, you take this and build something on it. Let me give you an example in extremis, which is something we all have more or less had an experience of, because there, under the circumstances, one downplays the credibility of a reporter. Besides the chief editor or the director, and I'm sure Iliana and Petra will have a lot to say, because I'm amongst those who believe we also should be assuming our share of the responsibility, I have to say many times we found ourselves trapped. What do you have to say about that? Well, I'll say one thing about that. Around me, I see many people who have said no on many occasions in their lives, and they have paid the price for it. And many of these people you have been able to follow as of their interventions this morning. No is an option. No is a two-word short term, and there is no problem in saying it. And perhaps sometimes you have to pick your battles. Let me give you an example. Kafmerini is the newspaper I work for, and there has been much talk about Kafmerini not airing enough of the story of no separation of the church and the state has been obtained. Do you know how many times we had to excuse ourselves for being wrong? Well, apologizing needs some kind of candid approach, and there are many colleagues who do not have this candid approach. Sometimes you just have to say you're sorry, you made a mistake. Well, whether in the traditional media or in the social media, sometimes being too much of a guiltful person doesn't pay, and this sense of guilt is not always welcome. You know that New York Times traditionally publish one column every day where they explain what went wrong on the day before. Sometimes it's just normal.
Thank you very much for your response. You asked me, Anna, why I left. Why you left Greece and how you got to where you got. Well, I studied in London, politics, and I left in order to study politics in London. There is a difference in how we construe political science and how it's construed abroad. The view here is that if you haven't been to law school, there's no chance that you will accomplish anything. Anyway, I wanted to work in political journalism, and when I was close to graduation, just a month earlier, Greece was going through the throes of the referendum. And I jotted a few ideas on a piece of paper, which I sent to the Financial Times. It turned out to become viral. It reached Greece. It received some coloring. There were those media translating my letter and coloring it in a certain manner, unintentional as far as I was concerned, and that freaked me out. I felt unready, unprepared as the holder of a non-journalism degree to try my luck in Greece, and that's why I thought that it was a very good idea to have the iMEdD here because I could see no other springboard for one to engage in journalism here in Greece. Now, how did I find myself in the New York Times? It was partly my persistence and partly my weathering many refusals. I must have sent some 500 email messages. There are no entry-level posts. I kept sending them missives for 3 months. And my chance came with the referendum on Brexit in the UK. And the London bureau chief of the time, my current boss, said that well, this is quite a persistence to reckon with here, and I thought you deserved a chance. That's what he said. So, my advice to people who want to become journalists would be that notwithstanding how difficult a profession it is, how little money there is in it, how it is a dying breed and what have you, well, all that may be so, but by keeping at it, you can turn into an intern and then you can turn into a reporter, which is what happened to me. Now, about how people are dealing with a crisis, isn't this an interesting moment to be a journalist? That's my take. Any journalist based someplace in Europe has to contend with a certain opposition, with journalistic culture that's based on fake news. Trump is responsible for that to a degree. Any piece one might write, you have bots amongst social media that may say that your piece is fake news, and that's an automatic sort of reaction. So it's really, really easy for anyone or anything to repudiate your work and claim it's false, a lie, fake. Now, this being my first stint with NYT, not a jot would be removed unless I'd been through a piece twice over. And that is how to ensure credibility, and that is why journalists are responsible and in what they're responsible. So I agree with what Mr. Deloglu said about the need to post corrections, amend the errors. There's no leeway to let anything just fly, because that means you're opening yourself to a lot of aspersions, and that's a risk most people would be unwilling to take. For the time being, I think that you've seen what's happened while you were here in Greece with subscriptions going up during Trump's stint, talking about our arsenal in journalism. It is true that the American election saw an increase in subscriptions, but given that this has ground to a halt, the reasons having disappeared for that to happen, it's visual tools that are privileged now, not storytelling. There'll be time enough to talk about this later on. Now, what about you, Bertrand?
So, I am the CEO of the Global Editors Network, the worldwide association of editors-in-chief. It means that I'm traveling every month. I'm visiting 2 or 3 newsrooms every month in all countries. So from Japan, Argentina, Denmark, Greece. And I'm working here in Greece with Christos Memis from Protagon. the job of journalists has fundamentally changed in the sense that 10 years ago, you had to write and edit paper, and you had this collective intelligence. A newsroom is a collective intelligence because you have different levels of checking the information. And Anna Kintia, you were in the TV, and you had to produce video, you had to produce shows. So it was not simple, but it was fixed. The work of journalists was defined 250 years ago at the Times in London, when it was not yet the Times. But this job position was quite fixed. And in 10 years, everything changed. And I will take 3 examples. It's about curation, verification, and collaboration. Curation. We produce more data in 18 months than during the whole humankind. Data doesn't mean news, but curation today becomes a huge part of the work of a journalist. To make a hierarchy, you have thousands of people at Google, at Facebook, just doing curation. And I hear a lot of young journalists here, and you know LinkedIn because you are looking for a job. And at LinkedIn, there were 3 people for curation of news, and today more than 100, just for curating news in English, and it is just in 1 language. So curation becoming really not 1/3 of the work of a journalist, but an important part. Secondly, verification. Verification, fact-checking in the US press, in the US is very classical, more than 150 years that you had fact-checker. But today, we produce more than 1 million video every hour. So news verification, again, it's not curation, but news verification is the best way to fight misinformation. But where are the resources? In the sense that in the US, they have lost half of the workforce. In France, it is 1/3, and I think in Greece, it is more than 50%. The number of journalists compared to 10 or 15 years, 10 to 15 years ago. So you have more work. And I'm not speaking about technology here, that you have to learn how to make blogs, how you have to learn how to be efficient on social media. So every 2 or 3 years, now you have to deal with WhatsApp, now you have to deal with Telegram to encryption, and you have to think blockchain, maybe it can be helpful for journalists. So to be a journalist is quite an insecure position. In fact, you don't know what you do. That's the problem of journalists. They were trained to do something, they thought they were doing something, but today they are lost. We are lost. We are lost. So, and I think we have to, for instance, there were media literacy. It seems obvious for a journalist. Oh, I know that I'm doing a good job, fair reporting, honest, balanced, blah, blah, blah. It works. But they don't know almost nothing about social media and how media issues are working on social media, on the new platforms. And so, again, we have this problem of being lost, and and we don't find the way, even young journalists, I think, to just have an idea of what is the job. Editors asking something, but they realize that in fact the editors don't know. And the third element is collaboration. I started with this idea of collective intelligence in the newsroom, and it's a fact. But today, collaboration tools are everywhere, and you can work from global to local, from one country to another one. So it's something totally new, and here we just have the tools to do this collaboration work. So it was just for starting. I'm not. I will give you the floor, but curation, verification, collaboration, something we didn't know almost 10 years ago, and I think in our future. Now we have to think how to work with robots, how to work with algorithms. At the moment, we have a very bad ideas of platforms. Google, Twitter, Facebook. There is this kind of journalists, they don't like that. Publishers, it's worse. They don't like that at all. But we will have to work with platforms. We have to deal with them. It is totally stupid to consider that it's nothing, we will win, we have just to make alliances and then platforms, we can win against the platforms. It's not the case. It doesn't mean we have to renounce to everything, but fundamentally, we have to work with them and to create a leverage effect, not to say just to abandon. The problem is, it is my last word, the problem is that we will lose diversity, we will lose plurality, because what happens? What happens with the New York Times? What happens with Le Monde in France? What happens with Daily Mail in the UK? That you have a new alliance between the platforms and the major players. Before, the major players were against the platform. And today, no, there is this alliance, and they will win. They will deal with the big players, but the problem is behind. What will happen to small news organizations, and not only print, but broadcaster, TV, and so on? We are in front of a huge movement of concentration. And it is just the beginning.
Ναι, βέβαια. Το μικρόφωνο τόσο.
What will happen with the small languages?
For sure. I told you we will lose in diversity, and also for at the moment in the US, you have this expression called news desert. News desert. It means that some communities were not covered at all because they lost the daily newspapers, they lost the local radio, and so communities were no longer covered. And it seems, again, here political science not saying exactly the same, but always the same, but news desert, they voted Trump. When you have a news desert, when you have no discussion, when you have a kind of indifference, first you don't go to vote, and secondly you vote for populism or for this kind of movement. And what will happen with small languages that we have news desert? we will have language desert, for sure. Small countries are not targeted, but are threatened. Yes.
Πάντως, μιας και συζητάμε για τα νέα μέσα και για τις νέες μεθόδους πέρα από...
Since we're talking about new media, new methods and a new world, talking of new tools, new methods, and all that in tandem with values and collaborations and cross-checking and what have you. What is striking in journalistic terms is how, despite what we've heard about our financial problems, despite how media are not profitable, despite how the crisis has occasioned ever so many factors that are detrimental, what you find is that there is a mere minimum of investment in multimedia, in technology, at a moment when there are professionals out there who are well-versed and well-prepared, have brought all this knowledge along with them, but find no place where to apply this knowledge, to bring it to bear, even though they work in such media. What is your view on that? Well, if you go to a major medium and see their software there and their hardware and their keyboards, they are stuck in 2005. There's nothing newer than those editions. Bertrand alluded to collaboration. There is a possibility of getting something from some colleague abroad and being unable to download it, and let alone Mbps rates. I mean, we've got to keep our focus on rudimentary things. It's been ages since last time there was any kind of investment. And this situation was well entrenched even before the crisis. When you found television going digital and digital journalism taking over TV, there were many people who went abroad to get themselves up to scratch, get some training on the new media, and it's been all in all some 12 years where nothing's happened to revamp our platforms, our work environment. And it's not only that, it's also a question of attitudes and editing and editorship and huge debts run by the media. But what to do if your Windows software is 2004? Everything else is unimportant. You are lagging far, far behind. What about the Balkans, Maria?
Well, it's almost the same. Basically, there is a big gap between media and the technology companies. But it's also because of one reason, and that is because in the Balkans it's not popular working with the media, because there are so many media outlets that are bad. So the overall perception of the media is that this is something really, really bad, and only people who cannot work in some other industry work in the media. So even like, no, really, because even like good IT companies, they would like question whether to give support or donation to the media. They would rather do some other social justice kind of support. For us, for example, as a non-governmental organization, a non-profit, it's also very difficult to fundraise for the tech equipment or anything, because not so many donors want to invest. in that kind of support. And the other thing is, even if we want to hire in-house programmers, IT experts, it's very difficult to compete on the market because these people are usually like very expensive for a non-profit organization. Like you can pay, for one salary of programmer, you can pay like 5 journalists. So us managers always try to get more journalists than programmers, but then at the end also as a media organization, you also suffer because you cannot develop as some major players in the media field. So I agree that it will, at one point, it will be very difficult to sustain at the market and become relevant if you have big players merging with the big companies.
Το κοινό, για να επιστρέψω στο κομμάτι της χρηματοδότησης και...
Well, to go back to the financing aspect, since we need to have questions also from you, time is passing and it would be interesting to have your questions, your opinions. Nevertheless, having heard time and again about this model, and as we know how you work, and Maria gave us an idea of how things are, how does the public react to this kind of situation with donors, fundraising, grantors, and all those things? How is the public reacting to all this? Do they understand what you have to go through to raise funds? And does this affect your quality as a reporter?
Different because you cannot rely so much as I think in the Western Europe, I don't know how it is in Greece, on the support from basically the audience. So we on Balkan Insight have very small subscription scheme, but that's like 10% of our overall costs. But in overall, it's not very popular to support independent media. One reason is because the public in general is not interested to pay for news, because news are offered for free by tabloids and different kind of problematic media. And then those even who want to pay, there is a big issue of internet payment. So if you want to like pay to give a donation to the like media in Serbia, you physically need to go to the post and like sign like I don't know, a receipt that you cannot, for example, do it online like you can do in Germany or elsewhere. So for that sense, it's very difficult to fundraise in the public. I mean, we have one good, I mean, our perspective is different because we are regional. And then we have a bigger audience, and then we also have a bigger pool of donors. But then our local organizations are struggling a lot to basically gain funds, because most of the funds that were given to the media in the Balkans were actually development assistance and political funding. And now, as the crisis is moving towards the other region, basically donors left. So now you only have few foundations who are there, and then you, as I said before, you have different kind of models, mostly through EU accession support, but this is basically project-based journalism.
Bertrand?
I think also we have to think geopolitics. If we take this example of fact-checking misinformation, in the US, through foundations, at the moment you have more than $200 million focused on this aspect after Trump, because here the foundations really funding research as they want to understand, 200 million. In Europe, it is less than 10% of this amount. But what we call misinformation in Europe and what we call misinformation or freedom of expression in the US is not the same. So at one moment, sure, I think we can overcome the crisis of misinformation, but it will be with the view of the US. And Europe, they will just about the tools. because you will have fantastic tools created in the next 2 years. And we can already see some of them at Pointer, at the Nieman Lab, at Stanford. Stanford is a fantastic center for that, based on a certain ideology. So here, Europe doesn't exist. It is US. Take another example, mobile. At the moment, all the chips, all the technology produced in China, a bit in Korea, but produced in China. Micropayments, it doesn't exist here. Everything, it works very well with WeChat, with Tencent, with ByteDance. And today, the most valuated company in AI, in artificial intelligence, is Toutiao ByteDance. And they have more valuation than for AI, not globally, but for AI, than Google or Facebook. So at one moment, when you have so many engineers, so many power dedicated to a certain industry, to a certain aspect, they will decide the future of mobile news. And again, Europe is nowhere. So think always not only about the products, the services, we are journalists, we have brains, but about geopolitics. And I think here there are real threats regarding Europe.
Thank you very much. There are so many more questions to be put through, but I need to have your views and ideas. I need to have your opinions on what is being said. Here is a first question coming from this person on the first row. Use a microphone, please. Well, I'm starting with my appreciations for your ideas. I'm a citizen, and as such, I have a question. What I find disconcerting in this 21st century, as far as reporting is concerned, is the entanglement of so many business interests coming from the various media houses. And as this is something the common citizen knows of, one always wonders whether the kind of information reaching him or her, or the kind of reporting followed, is somehow oriented by the interests of this or that media organization. So that's my question. You as a panel, what kind of ways would you come up with in order to, first of all, consolidate your profession and also ensure good information for the citizens? And the answer can be given by whom exactly? It's a general question. Then Iliana. Well, let me start by saying this. It's a question that keeps being put through by so many. Personally speaking, and in doing so, is sometimes I know I'm not believed. Over the time during which I've been with the New York Times, not once has been a circumstance where I felt I was oriented or was asked to report something in a specific way or to change my stance and line of thought because of this or that, nor has there been any professional treatment in the way news are covered. Of course, each one of us as a professional has at some point in time to say no. Mr. Telegusto said, saying no might not be that detrimental as saying no to a business proposal. For example, we are reporters who are expected to say no if need be. And because a change of stance might affect views and subscriptions, it goes a long way. Of course, at the end of the day, we're also working for businesses, and that's what some of our income comes from. But opting for this or that topic to cover also is conditioned by one's desire to maintain a certain level of quality, and sometimes the kind of reporting one wants to be associated with is also very much conditioning one's way of reporting. Of course, there are those who are so mindful of the views they will be gaining and how trendy one's report is. But it's about professionalism, what we cover, how we cover it. Essentially, within the public discourse, each one of us establishes one's own agenda, and it's a major responsibility. There's an oxymoron of sorts here over the last 3 or 4 years. We have experienced a shrinking of activities in other domains. Editors are not very much present now elsewhere than in reporting. There's only one media organization that is busy on more than one activities onshore. There are offshore activities, of course, but there's another aspect. In Greece, there have been 2 elections that were determined by the discussion on how the average Greek would get rid of the sovereign debt of his country. It is a private debt that also determines one's stance, and the attitude adopted by this or that factor vis-à-vis the private debt. Each country has its own particularities, but if one takes one step back, and indeed for one to establish today whether adopts a specific position vis-à-vis this issue, one has to know whether this reporter is burdened with high or limited private debt.
Κάποιο άλλο ερώτημα?
Any other question?
Hello, my name is Eva Constanteris. I'm an investigative data journalist. And my question goes to what Andreas was saying about trust and beaming people up, and what Bertrand was saying about news deserts. So we've seen sort of a flourishing of investigative journalism since Brexit, since Trump. But the reality is Philippines doesn't read Rappler, Hungary doesn't read Direct 36, Greece doesn't read Inside Story. What do we do to make sure that journalism is fulfilling its role as a democratic institution and actually arriving at citizens? And do these cross-border models like ICIJ and OCCRP, do they actually overcome that, or do they actually just make investigative journalists sort of for an international elite instead of a national elite? So what are alternative models that you've seen, like Bureau Local in the UK, or like ProPublica's local investigative journalism model, to try to push out investigative content and data to local level journalists? And will that work? Will that sort of turn the situation around so we don't see the sort of rise of ethno-nationalism and this growing distrust of media because good information is not getting down to the grassroots level? And I guess that Bertrand has really sort of wide experience of different models. Bern, I'm sure, faces the same question all the time because, again, all of Serbia doesn't read Bern. So what are you trying to do to make sure quality information gets to all citizens?
Andrea?
Yeah, the only thing, I mean, sorry,
Andrew, the only thing we as a charity can really promote, since we're not just in the media, is that we are endeavoring through iMEdD to promote the good use of technology to the interest of investigative reporting. It has all to do with how the agenda is elaborated and what the ultimate purpose of an organization is. As we don't have any other agenda, I truly say that If we create an open space for the young to feel hopeful and courageous enough and helped by technology and know-how, we will be getting somewhere, especially if we combine this with cooperation schemes throughout the world. I believe that gradually and steadily this may be built from a bottom-up approach. An ongoing effort is required by all those acting in this field, and everything is built around the young. Hence the need for technology to be put to good use. I don't know whether anyone else would like to position oneself on all this, Maria or Bertrand?
Well, I sort of disagree with that, and I always say that journalism cannot fix the system. Journalists can just do their job. So imagine a Hungary where there is no direct, and how would that society feel? I mean, direct and the small impact they have is a result of Orban's grip on every possible mainstream media outlet in Hungary. So direct is doing their best. They cannot be, I don't know, mainstream simply because there is no option for them to be mainstream. And the way how, for example, some international centers work, as you said, for the elite, I don't see that as a bad thing, because this is one way, for example, how you influence domestic politics. In case, for example, of BIRN, what we publish in English, it doesn't mean that it's read by, I don't know, local person in, I don't know, some town in Serbia, but it's read by a decision maker in some country, including my president of Serbia. So, for example, international community reads what we publish, and then they pressure our government, for example, on human rights, on freedom of media, on various things that we report as well, OCCRP and other journalists. So I never, for example, as a director, expected that everyone in Serbia reads me, but there is also, I would say, clear obstacle why is that not possible. What we are trying to do is to engage more people, to have their stories heard. And we cannot, obviously, because we are also small, do it with everything. But what we do is that we pick topics that are underreported. Like we do transitional justice, we do monitoring of courts, we do environment. So this is the topics that we choose to be important to our citizens. But as I said, with the resources we have and with the clear obstacles from the societies we are in, and I think Serbia and Hungary are more or less the same, it's not also realistic to expect from small investigative center to change everything. But we also think that we're bringing a small change. It's not like we're public broadcaster, but if there is a public broadcasters working the stuff BIRN is working, then BIRN would not need to exist, and I would do some nice consultancy job, which is perfectly fine. But unfortunately, we don't have public media or more media working in the public interest.
Yes. I think we don't have the good concepts, the good values. For instance, when you read about the crisis of media at the moment, either in the US, either in Europe, everybody wants to restore trust, as if there was a golden age of trust 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and today we are in crisis. So we just have to come back to the former situation. And so the problem is that trust is the value of a consensual society. When you have a majority, opposition, it's clear, and at one moment, democracy is respected because you have one government and so on. But what happens with social media is that you have hate speech, you have harassment, a lot of harassment, personal harassment, and you create through, not only through social media, but you create polarized societies. And within a polarized society, it's impossible to restore trust. Because when you don't agree with some news, you say, oh, they say that because they are right, or because they are populist, or because they are extremist. And so trust and polarized society, it doesn't work together. And we are today entering in polarized society. So we have to find new ways to deal with this issue, because we want democracy. We want, for sure. So we have to work on that. I'm writing a book on that, but not yet, but yes. So I think the concepts are not here. And I don't want to finish with a negative aspect, because we are here to be positive. It's obvious. You are journalists because you are positive, I'm sure. So I think a value which will work is transparency, because at the moment you don't know who owns this media, who is behind this person, and you have, you know, about influencers. Today you have influencers, so-called influencers, more followers than Catemirini or more than Libération in France. 1 million followers for a fashion influencer, and you don't know who is behind. You don't know. So I think people at the moment, they are quite reluctant about trust, but they ask for transparency. So we have to fight about transparency. And I think we are doing this work with Reporters Without Borders. And I think it is quite important to today, because it is the value of the future. So we have to start with that. And after we will see. But first, transparency. When you read something, you need to know who is behind. And you have three possibilities about, you can rank or make a statement about the news organization. You can make a statement about the journalist writing. Is he trustful? Is he relevant? Is he enough sources? And about the article. And at the moment, you have so many tools. 10 tools related to news organization, 100 tools related to the journalist, and the same for the articles. But so we have to create new tools, and at one moment we will find a way to define what is good journalism. But we are just starting.
Μπορώ να προσθέσω κάτι όσον αφορά...
If I may add something about social media, just to remain on the positive note, for sure, this polarization is quite obvious.
And the social media have made it much easier for that to be expressed, because you are always acting behind your PC or your laptop or your smartphone. But what's the point of the anger and the hatred and the polarization in the public discourse? It is, of course, where it emerges, but surely that's not the reason behind it. Social media are bearers of countless ills. That said, I use them all the time. They are an ocean of data. It makes it easy to find people through Instagram or Facebook or whatever. If you can't find someone's phone, you can get in touch with a lot of people by using social media for the purposes of your job, and you can identify information on people that you might be investigating. Not a nice idea, of course. But, you know, with the terrorist attacks in London in 2017, had it not been for social media, I really don't know how we would have laid our hands on so much information on all those victims. So people get to know what the implications are of such an attack. It's not just ciphers, it's human lives. And without social media, how would you have gotten in touch with kith and kin and friends and get people to talk about the people who became victims? So there's life behind the ciphers, and even though there's this huge bag of evils attached, there's much to be said for social media. And going to what Bertrand said, there was more trust in the past. The trust is something that's wagered from moment to moment. You can lose trust at a snap, and transparency helps. Polarization is a chicken and egg situation. Is it society? Is it the media that bring about polarization? But polarization is a fact of life. So it is an obligation to bring the level of polarization down. Social media should see to that. CNN, look at CNN. 20, 30 years back, when it started out, it was the oracle, the mouth of the oracle. Now CNN is walking down a path that finds some people in agreement, some not. It points to how the media are also part and parcel of the problem, and poses a question of transparency, whether the mass media or the social media, what it takes for journalists to broach a new environment and see how they're supposed to comport themselves therein. Well, it's really, really interesting, given how we are debating all of this, to see what Antonis Diamandouros might have to say to us. He publishes the National Herald. How does he make it hold its own, this kind of newspaper in our day? And the other interesting thing to hear from you is where it's aimed at, what it's trying to achieve. Andreas. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to take you to the diaspora in the US, the Greeks in diaspora. And I want to speak of the National Herald, which has certainly felt the onus of the crisis that has hit worldwide mass media really hard. And it's one of the outcomes of the techno revolution that is happening now. I feel that we are somewhat less exposed to risk of this kind compared to others. I think that we are served with excellent opportunities that we should capitalize on. For a start, I'd like to share some information with you. Back from 1890 down to 1920, some 10% of population of Greece emigrated to the US out of many journals, papers that circulated back then. It was only the National Herald, year of inception 1915, continues to be published. To be exact, it's the only daily published outside Greece and Cyprus. So, for the record, I am not its founder. I just purchased it back in 1979. Past 100 years, we've been through wave upon wave of tech revolutions that have really appeared quite dire for the future of Greek newspapers. An example from our story. In 1915, the National Herald used telegraph wires for just 5 lines of news. The opponents of the National Herald just didn't believe that the technology was in place and available. Through our lengthy odyssey, there's one truth that we have learned well. Either you walk in step with tech, or you are wiped out. A confession is in order here. There are days when it appears that no matter what we do, we won't be able to hold our own. But that said, not everything is negative. For example, we are inured to a degree from the winds of change that are hitting at mass media, because we write up the news and our commentary that is intended for the Greek diaspora in the US. So that's a good niche market. But let's not fool ourselves. We are engaged in a race. We need to change and do that fast. However, that said, at the end of the day, I think we stand to gain much more than merely our survival. Why? New tech has opened up a huge market for everyone, including us. So we can go many steps beyond what people would have thought years back. Namely, we can get an audience all over the globe where Greeks are to be found. And there's an additional reason why I think we will pull through. I believe that the future belongs with the mass media. The mass media that people put their trust in. As Andrea said earlier, we see that subscribers of the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post are rising. The figures for the New York Times stand at 2.5 million online subscribers. What of the major sites then? BuzzFeed, Vice, Huffington Post. Lots of cutbacks, especially recently. At the end of the day, what's significant is not how news are transmitted to readers. What's important is the reliability and trustworthiness of the media. And the readers of the National Herald who put their trust in our paper, and many of them believe, Father Thomas, that we are more or less something like the Bible. We are not, of course. Anyway, what stands in favor? in summary, our 103 years of history, 104 come April, our brand is one that people trust. The National Herald is a paper people trust. And the third thing is that we are really engaged in this ongoing fight to maintain our two editions, the Greek one and the English-speaking one, and to increase our subscriptions to our web pages, which are on a subscriber firewall basis, paywall basis. So we have our allies in this here across the Atlantic. I've got my family too, my kids, my son is in the back row. This may be a difficult time for us, but it affords us an opportunity that we could have never conceived of. And there's one last thing I'd like to add. While we struggle as a National Herald to make do, our market has collapsed. Our church is bankrupt. The ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople, to which our church belongs, is beset by its own problems that we know of. And assuredly, Greece is currently not in one of its happy patches. So that makes us at the National Herald try to make up for deficiencies that they should be addressing. But we do it with respect, with love, with interest, and with gumption. And in closing, I'd like to voice my gratification and congratulations to Andreas and his team for the wonderful job they are doing here in Greece and in New York. What they're doing in New York is beyond the bounds of the imagination, really. And they are quiet about it. But there's also the center here, such a wonderful thing. So what remains then to wish them success. Thank you very much. Is there any question from you or from our roster of speakers here that we should be taking up and pursuing? Yes, good afternoon. Here's a question. The talk has to do with reliability and credibility of the news, pointing to the huge crisis currently. We haven't spoken at all of quality of deliverables and what comes out in the media. In the past, you would read journalists who handled the language beautifully. What we read currently is inferior in quality. Or is that of no import any longer, given how the major wager is credibility? And is quality an antediluvian question? Well, I think that our set of questions has to do with the recent past, the recent crisis, the new trends, the developments in the day after period, as we find ourselves in hiatus, and one wonders, once this has washed over us, are we going back to the past, or are we going to change a page and find ourselves a new setting. And considering all this stuff, you go back to the language issue. Well, we would expect that journalists' handling of the language would be outstanding and their critical stance, but it's something that falls on the wayside. We hardly talk about all that any longer.
More or less you are right, but what you miss is that journalists were speaking with words. Today they are speaking with data. The big change between journalism 20 years ago and today is that journalists, they can rely on data. Which kind of data? First, I will take the example of ARC, the content management system of Washington Post. So it's really related to this kind of question. You can test in real time all the headlines you want. And at one moment, so you have the journalist, good journalist, trying 5 headlines, sent to 10,000 people here, 10,000 people here, and in 1 minute, the system, it's automated, but the system can see which headline works. It totally changed the job of the journalist. Before, he said, I want this headline. It's finished. And ARC, this kind of content management system, now they sold it to Le Parisien in France, and they sold it in Canada. They try to sell it everywhere. But this idea of the journalist with his words saying, I know my audience, is not true. And because of the data, they can see, oh, I thought this headline was the best one. No, not at all. It is the second one or the third one working well. And immediately the system will change for that. It's an example of how journalists worked before and how they work today. And regarding data, you have AI-driven storytelling. Evidently, I will take the example of, I have time? Yeah? Of AP. They covered with journalists, 50 journalists, they covered 200 companies, a medium-sized company in the US. And today they are covering 5,000. Why? Just because you have the beginning of an automated newsroom. It means that there is an algorithm checking data, comparing the results, the outcome of this company last year, 2 years ago, what went well, what went wrong, and so on. It is totally automated. So you can say it's bullshit, okay, because it's produced by a robot. But in fact, there is no real difference with the work done by basic journalists and now a robot. And it means that those journalists can dedicate more time to quality journalism. And it was the question here. So they can analyze. They don't lose time to just put the facts on a sheet of paper or on a keyboard. They just change the level of their work. So, and you have this example with companies. In sports, it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same in sports. You don't have to say, oh, at the 13 minutes this thing happened or not. Don't lose time. The machine will do it. The robot will do it. So you can dedicate more time to analysis. So I think you cannot say, oh, before the language was so important, quality journalism was based on that. No, 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 no.
Θεωρώ ότι
I do agree with what has been said so far, but it's quite optimistic for a country like Greece to believe that the only problem about language has to do with data flow. I believe that much more than that, and I say this as a consumer of Greek news, as I work elsewhere, worldwide speaking, because of the internet and the big competition online, there is so much pressure as to who comes first up with a piece of news. This is where the whole point is, and rather than who's using what kind of language. Too much emphasis has been placed upon speed and swiftness, and that to the detriment to the quality piece of journalism, even if we know that sometimes lagging behind leaves room for others to get ahead of you. I have a disclaimer to put forward, as I have never worked here. I've only done some kind of internship, but it's also to do with the crisis and perhaps the way we use Gringlish when we navigate the mass media again, the social media again. This is detrimental to the language. Over the years, this has also been detrimental to the language. I agree with what you just said, and there are three questions. You might believe I am tempted to answer my friend Antonis. I may have been prodded, but I won't bite. I just wish his newspaper to age up to be 200 years old. I'd like to thank Mr. Drakopoulos and the Foundation for the opportunity given today. My question goes to Mr. Telaglu. I've known him for quite some time, and he's an experienced reporter, quite respectable too. So, here's my question. Much has been said, and important as well, about transparency, trust, quality. You also used a term that to me stuck. It was the no, the right to say no. It is about a reporter's ethos, really, and here comes the question, Tassos. This ethos of journalists that used to exist and nobody put into doubt in the past, what about today? What has happened to it? What with the way newspapers and magazines and the mass media operate with everyone in front of a screen, whereas in the past there was a kind of mentor, there was a spiritual father in journalism. Who is going to teach those people ethos? And is there anything of the kind, ethos, anymore? And yet another thing, you did say something about you're having rarely, if ever, been pushed by employers throughout your career. I have had some 10 years of intense activity at the Archbishop's office with so many mass media chasing us and even sometimes molesting us. And as in the past, there was no such thing as a church reporting Christodoulos. The Archbishop was the first who launched this, followed by others. At the time, there were young people, quite likable, nice people, who said they are keen on doing some church reporting, although they had nothing to do with it. Many times they came to us and said, "Father, will you please tell the Archbishop to say something so that I can take it and be the first one to report and have something to give to my editor?" Because he told me, unless you bring me something from Christodoulos, who is selling quite well, you'll be losing your job. So this is the kind of ethos we are experiencing today. How can you conciliate all that? When it comes to ethos, I would say that although we're mostly given to working in front of screens, there are many possibilities to exchange views with older, more senior colleagues, and not everything is new. You know, most things date back in time quite a lot. So there is a need of this kind amongst young people to do that. And many times young reporters are much better than we are, and they are smarter, and they also know what to avoid and when to avoid it, and sometimes they know how to drive around the traps. It happens less with electronic media and more with conventional ones. In electronic media, sometimes you are looking for one's guidance once the mistake has been committed, because time is pressing and first you make a mistake, then you ask for advice. But when it comes to the church reporting, really I have no special knowledge about it. As to what the case was in the past, I'm sure what you described is a fact. Given the kind of usages that the church introduced at the time, it also had a share in the embarrassment, and I believe that that was a kind of tango that took two, of course, to dance. And because you mentioned the late Archbishop Christopoulos was after publicity, and many times he ever intervened towards being positively covered, and once you are trying to change someone's agenda to have positive coverage, then there must be a reason, and the same reason may also cut both ways and become negative. Good evening. My name is Mia Colli. I'm also a reporter. I have been following what you've been saying with much interest. Perhaps Bertrand is the one to give me an answer to what I'm going to ask. Since we are having with us one of the best Greek reporters of our time, and since it would be an illusion to hope that copying and reproducing over the internet is something impossible to combat, however smart young people may be, Tassos, there are so many of them who are choosing the easy way and just copycat things and repeat. Now, I'm giving you an example. Let's take a documentary film of Tassos. Some of those documentaries are no longer accessible on the internet. Could there be a time when things are generalized so much as for a reporter to have access to that?
Sorry, I have not understood the question.
Να την κάνεις μία πιο σύντομη, όχι, και πιο σύντομη, αν μπορείς πιο
And perhaps you could also rephrase your question and make it shorter. Well, do you believe that under current technological circumstances there could be a way for copying and very strict reproducing of news could be avoided, so that a reporter be incited to go back to the primary reporting? This would definitely make things more genuine and more trustworthy.
Okay. I will have the same kind of answer to Mr. here. It's about, and with you, regarding ethical issues. So you say, we have a problem. Older journalists, they had ethos, and younger journalists maybe not, they have the technologies, they have the knowledge, but they don't have the ethical behavior. The problem is not here today. The problem is in the ethics of the robots, of the algorithms. At the moment, you receive news through Facebook and through platforms, and the bias are not because a young journalist in Macedonia or somewhere have put fake news. It's not that the issue. The issue is in the algorithm. Do you have bias, gender bias, race bias? So when you think media today, don't think the producer, the content provider only. Think also that because of the new distribution system, dissemination system of news, the key problem is no longer at the end of the chain, but it is at the beginning. Who created the algorithm? And because you receive news, this feed you and not you. Why? Sorry, I'm not answering to your question directly. I try to explain how it works. Today, the news production, the news system, the news ecosystem. You have product managers. You have hundreds of product managers, thousands of product managers in Facebook and Google. And today, you will have product managers in the news organization. We have to learn that. We don't know how to do it, but we have to learn. It is a key element for understanding ethical issues.
Απλά θα ήθελα να κάνω ένα σχόλιο πάνω στην ερώτηση.
I would like to make a very brief comment on your question. I believe it would be quite a shame to generalize so much as to say that the older the journalist, the more the ethos present there, and this is not.
Σίγουρα.
There is an exchange off the microphone. Of course, a lack of ethos can be a problem at all times, but in general, well, maybe your question just triggered a series of reactions. In Greece, there is the mentality of, oh, you're young, so you think everything is easy and you're trying to avoid working harder, and the young are only dealing with internet, and you don't want to do traditional journalism. This is not true. I'm telling you this not just out of our experience. I believe that any young person, and it goes very much the same when it comes to my colleagues, it takes quite a lot to reach a point where you're truly confident with what you're doing and really picture yourself as a reporter, let alone being able to cooperate with more experienced professionals of your domain. One always needs advice, and senior colleagues should always be there to guide us, given their own experience. I never did not mean that was not my intention. It's the way of thinking. It has nothing to do with people. It's the senior colleagues that really orient us and help us. No, indeed, I know what you mean. Every young reporter is bound to adjust to the environment within which one is called upon to operate. The rules of the game are there, they've been there before you, they exist, and you have to abide with them. It applies to all professions. And something more, just one point more. In the beginning of that exchange, you asked me why I left Greece. I will not lie to you. As a young woman, I was mindful of becoming, even not consciously, but definitely really discriminated. And indeed, I don't know. There is some gender bias in Greece, and no matter how much we try to avoid it, it is still there. It is a man's world. Journalism is in Greece, and there are many examples. Not just about my case, it is my own experience. So to the extent that one allows to be discriminated in the way you describe, then it will happen to you.
Γεια σας, λέγομαι Χρήστος Ιερίδης.
Hello, I'm Christos Ieridis, Ethnos newspaper, media reporting. There is one trend, that of the so-called slow news. if we try to gauge how this model of getting the news is viable in our newfangled digital media, what's the future of the news, of news reporting? There's been a survey in Europe that shows that young people seem to have greater trust in newspapers as to the news they get from them than anywhere else. I've been to Trikala recently, visited with a friend from the past who had been the head of an anarchic group in Athens back then. He's opened an anarchist's library. He's at 60 now. This library, he explained to me, are the best books I had at home, but those assholes don't read anything. And he said that the pain he has experienced was plowed into that library, which shut 3 years back. Tatiana Panayotopoulos, I, and someone else tried to set up this long read kind of treatment of stories with 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words per piece. Now, there were plenty of people who would renew their subscriptions, but several of them walked away because they wanted shorter pieces. Is there a way away from that? To escape that? When all is said and done, what we used to call a text is no longer a text. It's an assortment of digitized data, including image and sound. Is this too heavy-handed, what I'm saying? But the very lengthy piece of text is what will see the end of our generation. You need the newfangled type of story you find in the New York Times or the Washington Post served in many new ways. How to do that without resources? Well, it takes some doing. And what about the training you need? It's not easy to get a good enough soundtrack recorded. So what we're talking about would be a digital account, a narrative. It's what Mr. Teloglu has been saying. And in the New York Times, there is this purposeful effort to go beyond digital journalism, to come of age with additional training, opening your mind with further education. It's a question of resources. The New York Times is fortunate in having such resources, and it's how to cut through loops so as not, say, to put up a picture in a story that will be enhanced by the moving image, even though it's soundless, because it relieves the monotony. And we use lots and lots of graphics, and that is a change. So, how stories are filed has turned into a different exercise. During the Grenfell fire, we had to deal with a different experience. We had to show how the fire spread from flat to flat. How come this tragedy occurred? So that was partly traditional reporting, But how that turned into a story, along with the graphics, was an eye-opener. Now, we have overstepped our time. Please make it shorter. There's brief questions still to field, and then the floor to you to conclude. Not quite a question, just to add what was said earlier, because he's not about to explain that himself. The Ideas Lab was set up 7-8 years back with the assistance of Mr. Drakopoulos. And this is what our think tank has been doing, turning the story into multimedia and infographics, stuff you know better about. Just 2 months ago, the New York Times presented an Ideas Lab product having to do with a survey on missiles in North Korea. Now, this is groundbreaking, and it capitalizes on Mr. Drakopoulos' idea, and it continues with other organizations in our neck of the woods and elsewhere in Europe. And for us, as odd as it might sound, it's what we've been attempting to work with our news. Because, truth to be said, the lengthy texts are not read. Press releases aren't read either. Human stories seem to be answering desire amongst our readership. Thank you, Lena Vlavianos. We didn't hear the second leg of your question responded to. Yes, true. Slow news as new evolution of newspapers. I think that it was responded to very politely. So we are dead and buried. Well, if newspapers recognize that they need to provide us with digital narrative, they are going to live. If not, no. One more question, please. Yes, I'm one of those old generation people. I like long text, but only on paper, not on the internet. Something over 500 words is too much for me. We spoke about fake news, propaganda, stuff like that. How to protect ourselves? Is there some sort of police to protect me as a Facebook user? Think of the picture of the refugee child apparently drowned at sea. Fake news, fake news, fake news is the commentary. We are still wondering whether a girl ostensibly killed at the National Technical University was actually among those killed back then. Was she a model, an Avon model? Will there be some sort of policing?
One piece of information. For instance, the former editor-in-chief of BBC, he created recently the Tortoise. It's about slow news, exactly what you said, and it's about curation. It's about long text, but not only. They will use visual journalism for sure. But so what we have to forget, I think, is the concept of mass media. We have more educated people, and we will go step by step to niche media. So you like long text, you will go to this kind of news organization providing what you want. And I think I will take the example of New York Times again. Mass media, for sure. 2.5 million users, and they want 10 million by 2022, something like that, 10 million. So mass media, but what are they creating? Verticals. They have a vertical on food. It's no longer about, oh, it's a section, we have a section on food, we have a section on travel. No, they are creating verticals for communities. So at one moment, it will be different from New York Times when they set up the business model, when they set up the community behind, when they invite users to write directly, and they don't do that at New York Times today, but with those verticals. So forget the concept, not forget, but change your concept of newspapers, of broadcaster, of mass media, and think niche media. Educated people, they will go where they want. And they will pay for that. They will pay for that. And so maybe you will say, I'm happy with that, with the tortoise, and I'm ready to pay. So it's really about niche media. The future of media for me is based on those verticals, and you have more and more, including newsletters. Everybody says newsletter, they are dead. It's dead. The business model is dead. Not at all. I will take a last example, Condé Nast. They launched last month Vogue Business. They didn't create a glossy magazine. They didn't create a new website, a fantastic website with the Condé Nast, with the Vogue photo. Not at all. They created a newsletter because their problem is to create a community ready to pay. So these are new business models, new ways to think the news.
Ναι, απλώς να πω ένα πολύ γρήγορο και κλείνω από μένα.
Something very swift before I close, a message to everyone dealing with the media and dwelling in that. There's a perennial expression about a pen being stronger than a sword. For those of you who dwell in the media, it's a major strength, but it's also an obligation. You have to do it correctly and ethically. If you approach it from a bottom-up point of view, you'll do a lot. Thank you all for being here and taking an active part in this debate within the context of these dialogues that today became part of iMEdD's first day. We'll be having another session within a month from now. It will be dedicated on the Rebetiko song, and especially Alexopoulos, I'm giving him up. He will be monitoring this dialogue on Rebetiko and the roots of this type of song. After this deculpabilization we've experienced, now we can open about it, or speak about it openly. And as the European elections are coming closer, May is around the corner, we'll be having more and more about it. We'll be speaking about the Day of Europe, the Europe of several gears, and who stays, who goes, what kind of balances to strike, a very enriching debate. And we are going, getting along up to 10 in the morning tomorrow. Be strong.
Journalists, to rise above fear and to probe, to give voice to the voiceless and to hold those in power accountable. Journalism is to be accessible to all.